I should have turned back the moment I realized the trail markers were painted in the wrong color. But by then, the fog had already swallowed the path behind me, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid about something as simple as park maintenance changing their system. It was December in the Cherokee National Forest, and I'd been hiking these mountains for 15 years. Long enough to know that the white blazes on the Citico Creek Wilderness Trail don't just turn red overnight. Long enough to know that the forest doesn't usually smell like wet copper and rotting flowers in the dead of winter. And definitely long enough to know that I should have listened to that primal part of my brain that was screaming at me to run. Before we begin, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to like the video and share it with your close friends and family. I would also love to hear where you are listening from. Thank you all for the support. It truly means a lot to me. Now, let's start. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour, and my breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have, like the atmosphere itself had become heavier, denser, pressing down on my chest with invisible hands. I'd left my car at the Brush Mountain trailhead around noon, planning a simple 6-mile loop that would have me back before dark. But the red markers led me deeper into sections of forest I didn't recognize, past rock formations that seemed to lean inward conspiratorially, their surfaces covered in moss patterns that looked disturbingly like handprints. My phone had lost signal 3 miles back, which wasn't unusual, but my GPS had started showing my location as a blank gray void, as if I'd somehow stepped off the map entirely, into some pocket of wilderness that didn't officially exist. The sound started just after 3 o'clock, when the winter sun was already bleeding pale light through the canopy, a rhythmic tapping that echoed from somewhere ahead on the trail, metal on wood, steady and purposeful like someone hammering fence posts in the middle of nowhere. I called out, my voice sounding thin and foreign in the oppressive silence between the taps. But no one answered, and the hammering continued without pause, never getting closer or farther away, no matter how long I walked. The trail had narrowed to barely a footpath, hemmed in by laurel thickets so dense they formed living walls on either side, their waxy leaves pressed so close I could feel them brushing against my jacket, and I noticed with growing unease that the branches bore deep scratches, parallel gouges that ran vertically down their trunks as if something massive had dragged its claws from top to bottom. That's when I found the cabin, or what was left of it, a collapsed structure of rotting logs that had no business being this deep in designated wilderness. Its roof caved in and its single visible window frame empty except for a few jagged teeth of glass that caught the fading light. The hammering had stopped the moment I stepped into the clearing, and in the sudden silence I could hear something else, a wet, labored breathing that seemed to come from inside the ruins, accompanied by a smell so foul it made my eyes water, like spoiled meat mixed with the chemical temps of old batteries. Every rational part of my brain told me to turn around, to retrace my steps, even if it meant hiking in the dark. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from that black rectangle of doorway, because I'd just realized that the breathing was synchronized perfectly with my own, matching my rhythm, inhale for inhale, exhale for exhale. I don't remember making the decision to run, but suddenly I was crashing back through the laurel thickets, branches whipping across my face and tearing at my clothes, my boots slipping on. Patches of ice I hadn't noticed before, and behind me I could hear something large moving through the undergrowth. Not chasing exactly, but following, maintaining a constant distance like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. The red trail markers seemed to multiply in my peripheral vision, appearing on trees that I was certain I hadn't passed, all pointing in different directions, and I realized with mounting horror that the trail had become a maze, branching in looping back on itself in ways that defied the topography I'd memorized over years of hiking these mountains. Darkness fell with unnatural speed, the kind of profound blackness that only exists in deep wilderness, and I fumbled for my headlamp. With numb fingers, nearly sobbing with relief when the beam cut through the night, until I saw what it illuminated 50 feet ahead on the trail. A figure stood motionless between two trees, facing away from me, wearing what looked like a ranger's uniform from decades past, the fabric hanging in tatters, and I watched in paralyzed silence as it slowly, impossibly, rotated its head 180 degrees without moving its body, revealing a face that was nothing but smooth, pale skin where features should have been. Like an unfinished sculpture of a human being, I ran in a new direction, abandoning the trail entirely, plunging into trackless forest, thorns ripping at my skin and my ankle turning on hidden rocks. And somewhere in that blind panic I must have found a road, because I have a confused memory of headlights and concerned voices and sitting in the back of a park ranger's truck wrapped in an emergency blanket. They told me I'd been found on Highway 665, 8 miles from where I'd parked, walking in circles in the middle of the road at 2 in the morning. My clothes shredded and my hands covered in scratches I couldn't remember getting. They asked me about the blood under my fingernails, asked me why I kept saying it matched my breathing, asked me if I'd taken any drugs or had any history of psychiatric issues. But they couldn't explain the photographs on my phone. Dozens of images I don't remember taking, all snapped during those missing hours in the forest. Each one showing the same thing from slightly different angles. My own face, unconscious or maybe dead, photographed from above by someone or something that had been standing directly over my body. And they definitely couldn't explain why. In the last photo, in the sequence, my eyes were open, staring directly at the camera. Even though I have no memory of waking up, no memory of anything except that terrible moment when I realized the thing. In the ranger uniform wasn't alone, that the forest was full of them, standing just beyond the reach of my headlamp. All of them waiting with the patience of mountains for me to finally stop running and accept what I'd become the moment I followed. Those red trail markers into whatever part of the Appalachians exists just slightly to the left of reality. Haven't been back to Cherokee National Forest, and I never will. But sometimes late at night I check the photos on my phone, and I swear the last image is different now. Swear that the expression on my face has changed from terror to something worse. Something that might almost be recognition, as if the thing behind my eyes in that photograph is slowly remembering how to operate a human face, learning to smile in a way that doesn't quite reach the skin around its eyes. The tapping started again last week, faint but distinct, coming from inside my walls at 3 o'clock every afternoon, and I've been finding red paint marks on the trees in my suburban backyard, leading away from my house into a patch of woods. That's never been there before, and I know with absolute certainty that one day soon I'm going to follow them, because whatever came back from those mountains wearing my face is getting homesick, and it's calling me back to a trail that only appears for people who've already walked it once and never really left. The vacation rental looked exactly like its photos online, which should have been my first warning, because nothing in the West Virginia mountains ever looks exactly like its photos, especially not a 200-year-old cabin advertised as restored and available for $40 a night in the middle of January. My girlfriend Emma and I had been driving through a snowstorm for 6 hours, our relationship barely surviving the stress of my recent job loss and her mother's cancer diagnosis, and we'd booked the place as a desperate attempt to reconnect. to find some quiet space away from the constant pressure of our collapsing lives. But the moment we pulled up the winding dirt road and saw the cabin sitting in its clearing of dead grass, surrounded by black spruce trees that seemed to lean away from the structure rather than toward it, I felt something in my chest tighten, with an anxiety that had nothing to do with our relationship problems. The owner had left the key under a rock shaped like a sleeping cat, exactly where his email said it would be, along with a handwritten note that read, "Please do not enter the root cellar under any circumstances," in spidery cursive that suggested arthritis or extreme old age. Emma laughed when she read it, made a joke about hillbilly horror movies, but I noticed she didn't find it quite funny enough to actually laugh with sound, just exhaled sharply through her nose, in that way people do when they're trying to convince themselves something isn't creeping them out. The cabin interior was sparse but clean, decorated with oil lamps and antique furniture that looked genuinely appropriate, and I tried to ignore the fact that all the mirrors in the place were covered with thin cloths, tried not to think about the implications of a host who didn't want reflective surfaces in his rental property. We'd planned to spend the weekend hiking and working through our issues, but the snow picked up around 8 o'clock that first night, coming down in thick, wet flakes that quickly accumulated to 6 inches, then 12, then 18, until the world outside the windows was nothing but white static and the wind made sounds like voices having urgent conversations just beyond the range of understanding. Emma found the board games around 9, a stack of vintage boxers in a cabinet beneath the stairs, Parseesi and Chinese checkers, and something called the Messenger's game that neither of us recognized. Its box decorated with an illustration of a faceless figure standing at a crossroads beneath a crescent moon. She insisted we play it, said it would be nostalgic and fun, and I didn't have the energy to argue. Didn't want to spend another evening in tense silence, punctuated by careful conversations that avoided everything that actually mattered. The rules were simple enough. A basic roll and move game where players traveled between towns collecting messages and delivering them to specific destinations. But the flavor text on the cards was disturbing in ways that felt intentional. References to the spaces between spaces and the ones who walk behind, and the price of remembering what should stay forgotten. We played for an hour, the wind screaming outside and the oil lamps flickering despite the absence of any draft, and Emma started winning by a margin that didn't make statistical sense, rolling exactly the numbers she needed turn after turn, landing on spaces that triggered card draws describing scenarios that felt uncomfortably specific to our lives. Messages about the terminal sickness of someone beloved, and the loss of livelihood and purpose, and the growing certainty that love is not sufficient to survive what comes next. I wanted to stop playing, but Emma seemed entranced, her eyes fixed on the board with an intensity I hadn't seen in months. And when I suggested we quit and go to bed, she looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize, her features arranged in something that resembled her face but wasn't quite right, the proportions subtly wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "We have to finish," she said in a voice that sounded like hers played through a damaged speaker, and she rolled the dice before I could respond, landing on a space marked with a black door symbol. And the card she drew made her go absolutely still. Her breathing stopped, her eyes locked on the text for a full minute before she slowly, carefully, placed it face down on the table and excused herself to the bathroom. I flipped the card over. The moment she left the room, my hand shaking badly enough that I nearly knocked over an oil lamp, and the message written there in the same spidery handwriting as the note about the root cellar read, "You are not playing with the woman you brought to this place, and she knows you know. And the only question now is how long you'll pretend otherwise before the thing wearing her skin gets tired of the game and shows you what it really looks like when it doesn't need to maintain the illusion anymore. I stood up so fast, my chair fell backward, my pulse hammering in my throat, and I called Emma's name. Called it again louder when she didn't respond. And then I heard the bathroom door open and close, heard footsteps coming back down the hall. But they were wrong, too heavy, hitting the floorboards with a weight that suggested something much larger than my girlfriend's 112-pound frame. The thing that came around the corner looked like Emma in the same way a photograph looks like the person it depicts. All the details technically correct, but lacking some essential quality of life, of humanity, and I could see now that its movements were slightly off, that it blinked too infrequently and smiled too widely and held its head at an angle that would have caused severe neck pain in an actual human being. "Your turn," it said, gesturing at the board, and I noticed that its hand had 6 fingers now, the extra digit protruding from the side of its palm like a tumor, and the rational part of my brain that was still functioning understood with crystalline clarity that I had 2 choices. I could run screaming into a snowstorm that would kill me in under an hour, or I could sit back down and finish the game and hope that whatever rules governed this situation might allow me to survive if I played. To the end, I don't remember most of the final turns. My mind refusing to process the cards I drew, the messages that described in excruciating detail every mistake I'd ever made, every small cruelty and failure and moment of cowardice, but I remember landing on the final space, the one marked home, in faded letters, and I remember the Emma thing smiling with what might have been genuine pleasure as it collected the cards and returned them to the box with its impossible hands. "You did well," it told me, and its voice had changed now. It had become something layered and resonant, like multiple people speaking in unison. Most people refuse to finish, and then we have to drag them down to the root cellar, and it's all very unpleasant for everyone involved. The storm stopped around 3 in the morning. The silence after all that wind almost painful. And when I went to the bathroom, I found Emma unconscious in the bathtub, fully clothed and shivering violently, with no memory of anything after we'd started playing the game, no awareness of the hours she'd spent not being herself. We left at dawn, driving through 2 feet of fresh snow, neither of us speaking about what had happened. And when we got home, we broke up within a week, the strain of our problems finally too much to bear, but that wasn't why our relationship ended, not really. It ended because sometimes I'd catch Emma looking at me with that same too wide smile, would notice her head tilting at that impossible angle, would see her hands and have to count the fingers to make sure there were only 5, and I realized that whatever had worn her like a costume in that cabin hadn't entirely left, that it had liked the fit well enough to keep visiting, trying her on occasionally like someone revisiting a favorite outfit. I drove back to the cabin last month, planning to confront the owner, to demand answers, but the dirt road was gone, the clearing empty except for a foundation of old stones barely visible through the undergrowth, and when I checked the rental website, there was no listing, no record that the place had ever existed. But I still have the card in my wallet, the one that told me I wasn't playing with Emma anymore. And sometimes late at night I take it out and read the text on the reverse side, the message I was too terrified to look at that night in the cabin. The one that says, "The game never ends, and every person you love is a space on the board. And the only way to stop playing is to forget you ever started. But you won't, you can't, because now you know to look for the signs. And once you start seeing them everywhere, in everyone, it's already too late to pretend you don't know what's looking back at you through the eyes of everyone you've ever trusted." The Bluefield Mining Company hired me to survey the abandoned sections of the Elkhorn Tunnel in southern West Virginia. a coal operation that had shut down in 1987 after 3 miners disappeared during a routine inspection of the deepest shafts. And when I asked the hiring manager why they were suddenly interested in unmapped tunnels after 37 years, he got this uncomfortable look on his face and told me that recent satellite imaging had revealed thermal anomalies suggesting active geological processes that might make the mineral rights valuable again. I'd been doing mine surveying for 12 years, had crawled through collapsed shafts and flooded galleries in 5 states, and I'd learned to recognize when clients weren't telling me the whole truth. But I needed the money badly enough to ignore my instincts. To take the equipment they provided and sign the liability waiver without reading it too carefully and descend into a hole in the earth that smelled like rust and decay and something else. Something organic and wrong that reminded me of the smell of a dead deer I'd found in my garage once, swollen and rotting in the summer heat. The main shaft descended at a 40-degree angle for 200 feet before branching into a network of lateral tunnels that my map suggested should have been relatively straightforward. A standard grid pattern with clear demarcations. But the moment I moved beyond the range of natural light, my surveying equipment started giving me readings that made no physical sense, showing tunnel branches that extended for miles in directions that should have intersected with surface features, with highways and rivers and other mines that I knew from public records weren't there. My headlamp beam cut through air that seemed thicker than it should be, almost liquid, and the wooden support beams that lined the tunnels were covered in a black fungus that released tiny spores when I brushed against them. Clouds of darkness that hung suspended in my light like they were too heavy to float, too deliberate to be mindless particles of mold. I'd been underground for 4 hours when I found the first divergence from my map, a tunnel entrance sealed with concrete blocks that someone had recently broken through, the rubble pushed aside to create an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. And I noticed with growing unease that the concrete was marked with dozens of handprints, all different sizes, all pressed into the material when it was still wet decades ago, like people had been desperately trying to push through from the other side, trying to break back into the mapped sections of the mine from whatever existed beyond that barrier. My professional obligation required me to document the discovery, to photograph the breach and mark it on my survey, but every survival instinct the first possessed was screaming at me to turn around, to get back to the surface while I still could, because the air coming through that opening was at least 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding tunnel, and it carried sounds that might have been machinery or might have been breathing, rhythmic and enormous, like something the size of a building. Inhaling and exhaling in the darkness, I went through the opening, and I'll regret that decision for whatever remains of my life, because the tunnel on the other side was wrong in ways that violated basic physics, its walls curving in non-Euclidean angles that hurt my eyes to track, its floor sloping both up and down simultaneously depending on which direction I looked, and the support beams were made from wood that was still green and living, sprouting thin branches and waxy leaves that had no business growing hundreds of feet underground in total darkness. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and my depth gauge claimed I was simultaneously at -300 feet and +200 feet, occupying impossible space that existed below and above sea level at the same time. And I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that I'd crossed some threshold, passed from the normal abandoned mine into something else, some space that the Elkhorn Tunnel had accidentally intersected back in 1987. A natural formation that predated humanity and followed rules that had nothing to do with geology or mining or any science I'd ever studied. The photographs started appearing after an hour of walking, dozens of them taped to the tunnel walls at irregular intervals, Polaroids that showed the missing miners from 1987. Except the images captured them at different stages of some horrible transformation. Their bodies elongating and their skin turning gray and their eyes migrating to the sides of their heads like they were evolving or devolving into something designed for deep underground existence. I recognized one of them from the newspaper articles I'd researched before taking the job. A man named James Corcoran, who'd been 43 when he disappeared. And the final photo in the sequence showed him looking almost normal, except for his legs, which had fused together into a single, thick appendage, more suited to pulling a body through narrow tunnels than walking upright on the surface. And someone had written beneath the image in shaky handwriting, "Day 147, I can see in the dark now, and I wish I couldn't. And the thing that lives in the deepest chamber has been calling my name. Except it's not my name anymore. It's the sound I make when I breathe, and I understand now that we were never lost. We were being processed, prepared for a purpose we couldn't comprehend when we still had the right number of limbs and the right kind of hunger. I ran then, my surveying equipment abandoned, my professional responsibility forgotten in the overwhelming need to reach daylight and sky and open air. But the tunnel had changed while I'd been examining the photographs, had rearranged itself into a maze of branching passages that all looked identical, all sloping gently downward no matter which direction I turned. And I understood with dawning horror that the mine wasn't just a passive space. It was alive in some fundamental way, conscious and purposeful. And it had been waiting decades for someone to break through that concrete seal and give it access to the surface world again. My headlamp died without warning. The batteries drained despite being fresh that morning. And in the absolute darkness, I could hear something approaching from multiple directions at once. Something that moved with the wet, sliding sound of that fused leg miner, accompanied by breathing that matched the rhythm I'd heard coming through the sealed opening. Except now it was close, so close I could feel the warmth of exhalation on the back of my neck. I don't remember how I got out, have no conscious recollection of finding the main shaft or climbing back to the surface. But I woke up in my truck in the parking area at dawn, with my clothes soaked in some kind of slime that dried into a gray, flaky residue, and my hands covered in scratches from crawling through spaces too narrow for a normal human body. The mining company refused to return my calls, and when I drove back to the site a week later, the entrance had been sealed with fresh concrete. The entire area fenced off with biohazard warnings and legal notices threatening prosecution for trespassing. I filed my partial survey report and collected my partial payment and tried to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of underground hallucination, carbon monoxide poisoning or oxygen deprivation causing vivid delusions. But that explanation fell apart when I developed the film from my camera and saw what I'd photographed in that impossible tunnel. The images show me dozens of shots of my own face, taken from angles that would have been impossible without someone else being present. And in each photograph, I'm looking directly at the camera with an expression of absolute terror while my mouth is open in a scream. I don't remember making, and behind me in the darkness there are shapes, pale and elongated, with too many joints in their limbs and eyes that reflect the camera flash like an animal's. And the worst part is that in the final image in the sequence, I'm not screaming anymore, I'm smiling. And my legs in the photograph are pressed together in a way that looks almost natural, almost comfortable, like I'm learning a new way to move, a new way to be. And I've started having dreams about going back, about finding that sealed entrance and breaking through and descending into the warm darkness where something patient and ancient is still calling my name in the sound of my own breathing. and I know it's only a matter of time before I stop fighting the urge and go back down into the earth. Because whatever I became during those missing hours in the tunnel left something behind when I returned to the surface. Left a hunger for darkness and enclosed spaces, and the promise of transformation into something that doesn't need light or surface air, or any of the things that define human existence. And I can feel it growing stronger every day, feel my body preparing for a journey down into spaces, where the only thing that matters is learning to breathe in rhythm with the mountain itself, becoming part of something so much older and stranger than the brief, panicked scramble of surface life.